Hello friends. About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did. Also, don't forget to press the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you all. From which country or city do you follow the channel?
The rusty old pickup truck jolted relentlessly down the uneven path. James Carter suffered in silence, mentally cursing the driver, the pothole-ridden road, and his own half-baked decision to uproot his entire life. To be brutally honest, nothing was carved in stone yet, but James's burning desire to relocate far outweighed any lingering wish to stay put. He had recently gotten on the phone with an old high school buddy who had settled in a sleepy little town nestled deep in the neglected backwoods of rural Kentucky, asking him to scout out a small private house James could rent for a few weeks, just long enough to dip his toes into that quieter existence and figure out if it was truly for him. The crux of it was that James, now a retiree with a meager and almost childish work record, had abruptly woken up to the fact that he had had more than enough of the filthy, overcrowded, soul-crushing city and its grim-faced, perpetually suspicious residents. This lightning bolt of clarity struck him exactly 1 month after he had hung up his work boots, a mere 2 weeks before the events now unfolding. That particular day, James was slouched on the sagging couch in his dreary and solitude-drenched apartment, staring blankly at the muted television screen flickering in the corner. Outside, it was a gloomy early October evening. The sky hung low and gray, swollen with every imaginable burden, threatening to dump it all on the earth below in a chaotic tantrum. A spiteful and misty drizzle pecked viciously at the windowpane, distorting both his view and his fragile mood. The oppressive and cotton-thick silence of his deserted apartment, interrupted only by the staccato rhythm of raindrops slashing against the glass, seemed to swallow him whole. He felt an overwhelming urge to leap up and scream, to rip apart both his throat and that suffocating stillness with a raw and furious cry. With a monumental effort of will, James restrained himself, rose slowly from the couch, and shuffled over to the window, gazing out at the street through the rain-streaked and weeping glass. James lived way up on the 8th floor of his dingy apartment building. Far below, some figure in a garish neon jacket scurried toward the overflowing dumpsters, clutching 2 hefty trash bags in their hands, only to hurl them carelessly mid-stride without even glancing to see where they landed before darting back toward the entrance. The bags slammed onto the cracked asphalt walkway a good few yards shy of their target, splitting open and scattering their unappealing contents across the ground. James wrinkled his nose in disgust, recognizing the culprit as Tommy Grayson from apartment 23, a loud-mouthed and self-proclaimed rebel known for stirring up trouble. Sinking back onto the couch, James snatched the remote off the cushion and cranked up the television's volume. Some program about farmers blared to life. The host was practically choking on his own enthusiasm, waxing poetic about agricultural economics like it was the second coming. James barely registered the words, his attention snagged instead by the sheer ridiculousness unfolding on the screen. It had to be a rerun, since the trees outside the farmer's barn glowed with calm and lush green, tinged only faintly with autumn yellow, while golden sunlight spilled generously over the dry and hard-packed dirt, the man's faded overalls, and the plaid flannel shirt poking out beneath them. What a moron, James thought with a flicker of disdain, not some backwoods hick but a full-on Jack American stereotype. Still, the farmer's awkward and lumbering presence didn't hold his focus for long. What really gripped him was the serene tranquility that seemed to pour straight out of the screen, unshaken by the host's hyperactive babbling or the dreary and storm-shadowed reality pressing in around James's own world. Remote still clenched in his fist, he slipped into a reverie of his long-gone childhood, his mother's soothing voice the steady axis of his small universe, the soft dawn breaking over the outskirts of his hometown the heartbeat of existence, and the sharp whistle of his best pal summoning little Jimmy from the house for another wild and thrilling escapade, now just a bittersweet ache in his chest. The weight of it was almost too much to bear. Tears prickled at the corners of his eyes. James swiped them away with an irritated flick of his hand and reached for the scratched-up cell phone sitting on the cluttered coffee table. That explained why, just a few seconds later, after a loud and unapologetic ring cut through the stillness, he found himself rattling down a dusty road toward a tight-knit cluster of homes where folks all knew each other by name. The shouting and chatter, honestly, left a lot to be desired, yet it didn't bother him one bit. James had somehow ended up with the worst seat in the truck, right smack over the rear wheel, but he had settled in just fine regardless. Everyone else sprawled out wherever they felt like sitting. All the while, James grumbled under his breath, stewing over the bumpy road, the rowdy passengers, and his own mushy sentimentality, though as a man who prided himself on sticking to his guns, he never once considered hopping out at the first gas station to turn tail and head back home. The thought did flit through his mind, of course, but as already mentioned, he was dead set on giving this move a real shot. Outside, the light dimmed fast, and the clock was inching toward 6. Inside the cab, only 2 others remained besides James, an old crone with gaps where teeth used to be and a young punk who wouldn't let go of his phone for a second. Through the creeping dusk, a broad sprawl of twinkling lights came into view up ahead. James nudged the kid's elbow to get his attention, jerking his head toward the glowing horizon. The guy flicked his eyes up, gave a lazy nod, and dove right back into his screen. James fished out his own phone and started dialing his buddy. The next morning hit him like a freight train, exhausted and foggy. The bottle of bourbon his friend had picked up hadn't lasted long, so they had cracked open some of his homemade moonshine to keep the night going. Mixing the two was always a roll of the dice, James reflected darkly. Who bothers thinking about consequences when the booze-fueled high is roaring through you? The question hung in his mind, rhetorical and unanswered, since he didn't see the point in dwelling on it. Wobbling on unsteady legs, James staggered to the bathroom to splash water on his face and shake off the haze. Moving the toothbrush sluggishly around his mouth, he replayed how his friend had eagerly spun tales of small-town life over their drinks the previous night. This place, truth be told, wasn't much more than an overgrown village masquerading as a town. His buddy lived in his own house too, and James had gotten a solid taste of the perks that came with a standalone place decked out with all the civilized trimmings, central heating, a gas line, and reliable electricity. Here's the rundown, his friend had declared over their makeshift dinner table. I tracked down a spot that fits your bill perfectly. It's sitting empty, though technically it's got owners, but they don't live there. They're asking peanuts for it. I told them you'd take it for a full month, since they wouldn't budge for less than that, he had added with a sheepish shrug. Honestly, it's better this way. Might run you a couple $100 more than just 2 weeks would have cost. Big whoop, since money's the least of your worries, and you won't have to deal with any headaches. Just live there, because no one's gonna show up unannounced. You hanging around long? What's the house like? Exactly what you wanted, log walls, 5 rooms, surrounded by wild bushes. 50 yards out, not a neighbor in sight, pure bliss. That whole stretch has a bunch of empty houses anyway. So what's the deal with that? James had pressed. Same as everywhere, the young crowd takes off, and the old-timers kick the bucket. Which was it there, did they leave or die? Beats me. I poked around, got hooked up with the right folks. We talked, agreed on a price. What more do you need? What, you spooked by ghosts or something? His friend teased with a sly grin. Nah, I ain't scared of nothing, James muttered gruffly. Just wondering, that's all. Well, I couldn't care less, his buddy shot back, his tone turning sharp. You told me to find you a house, and I delivered. Whether someone croaked or skipped town doesn't change a thing for me. No, it's fine, James hurried to say, smoothing things over. I'm grateful, really. All right then, his friend replied, pouring a generous splash of bourbon into their glasses. Let's toast to it. Tomorrow, we'll haul your stuff over and get you moved in. Come morning, when it was time to head out and see the place, all James could think about was crawling back into bed and staying still. Stepping out of the bathroom, he stumbled right into his friend's hearty embrace. "Good morning, you old dog," his buddy bellowed, clapping James hard on the shoulders. "How you feeling? Ready to tackle the day?" "Pretty much always," James mumbled, attempting a weak joke while his head throbbed like dot was short. Barely 10 minutes later, they rolled up to the town's outskirts and stopped in front of a rundown little house, its sagging fence more a suggestion of a boundary than any real barrier against prying eyes from neighbors or random passers-by. The front door let out a piercing squeal as it swung open, revealing a scrawny and unkempt man who looked like he had been dragged through a decade of hard living, a threadbare raincoat slung over his bony shoulders, one that probably dated back to the days of black and white television. Faded track pants with dingy and once white stripes hung off his frame, paired oddly with crisp and modern sneakers that gleamed white against the dirt. He shuffled out toward the gate with quick and twitchy steps. James and his friend climbed out of the car to meet him. "You got the money," the guy croaked before he had even closed the distance. "Hold on, since my pal might not even like it." "We need to take a look first," James's friend snapped back, clearly irritated by the pushiness. "What's there to look at?" the man retorted with equal annoyance. "It's a house, plain and simple, warm, clean, built from solid oak logs. Just move in already. We'll see for ourselves." "Let's keep this quick," James cut in, his voice low and gruff. "I've got a shift to get to," the guy grumbled. His friend let out a skeptical huff at that bold claim, brushed past the man, who stepped aside, and led James up to the house itself. The cabin didn't hit James as quite the letdown its owner had. On the contrary, it struck him as decently solid and perfectly livable, even if slapping the word "comfortable" on it would have been a stretch too far. A cramped little entryway, completely bare of anything worth noting, opened up into a spacious main room that pretty much made up the whole interior. Two small windows with crisscross frames sat on either side of a weathered table covered in scratched-up oilcloth, a rickety cupboard dangling above it. A stout stove with a broad damper hunkered in the far left corner, away from the door. A handful of faded and handwoven rugs dotted the floor, alongside a wide and heavy bench, and that was the extent of it. James cast a confused look around the place. "Didn't you say it had 5 rooms?" "That's what they told me," his friend replied, scratching his head awkwardly before wheeling around to fix the fidgeting owner with a hard stare. "You told me it was a 5-room place?" James's friend pressed, his voice tight. "Yeah, well, they knocked some walls down not long ago," the guy stammered, tripping over his words in a rush to explain. "I didn't even know till today. My sister, that no-good sneak, didn't bother filling me in. Swear on my life." "Keep your life," his friend growled, unswayed, then turned to James. "Come on, Jim, let's get out of here. We'll dig up another house for you, since plenty of them are around these parts." He started for the door, ignoring the owner's mumbled protests trailing behind. "Wait a sec," James called out, planting his feet firmly in place. He took his time pacing around the main room, feeling the floorboards creak and shift under his weight. A faint and nostalgic scent, sheepskin perhaps, wafted up from somewhere, tugging at a buried memory. Running his hand along the rough-hewn log wall, he inhaled deeply, then turned to the owner, who stood stiffly by the threshold, watching warily. "Where do you get water around here?" "Out back, there's a well," the guy answered. "The rope's missing, but go take a look." "Got a big garden too." "What's he supposed to do with a garden?" his friend interjected, scoffing. "He came here to kick back, not play farmer." "Sounds like a real treat." James shot him an annoyed glance but kept his focus on the owner. "All right then," he said evenly. "Let's go check out this backyard." They circled around the house, and sure enough, there was the well, its logs cut from the same stock as the cabin, likely raised in the same era. A flimsy lid of weathered and half-rotted plank sat atop it, crowned with a shiny new galvanized bucket tied to a length of rope. His friend let out another derisive snort at the sight of this so-called water system, prompting a quick defense from the owner. "It's always been this way around here. My granddad used to say you've got to put in work for the basics. He wasn't exactly a fan of fancy modern stuff." "Laughed at it, did he?" James's friend cut in with a mocking edge. "Yeah, pretty much," the guy hesitated, then added with a smirk. "Didn't care for it one bit," he chuckled at his own cleverness. "So, you in or what?" He glanced expectantly at James. His friend raised an eyebrow, waiting for an answer too. James took a slow look around the backyard, overgrown with brittle and dried-out grass and dotted with a lonesome outhouse, then tilted his head up at the brooding sky before turning back to eye the house itself. Stepping over to the well, he shoved the plank lid aside and peered down into its depths. The water, sitting higher than he had expected, hit him with a sharp and refreshing coolness that cut through the stale air. He suddenly ached to taste it, especially with that nagging hangover still clawing at him, begging for something to quench it. James dug into his pocket for his wallet. The owner, grinning like he had just won the lottery, hightailed it off under a barrage of sour muttering from James's friend. Off to drown his eyeballs in cheap liquor, that bum. James gave the cabin another once-over, then climbed back into the car with his buddy to fetch his belongings, already set on moving in that very day. His friend went above and beyond, hooking him up with a haul of household basics, some chipped dishes, a stack of old rags, a worn-out broom, and even a little electric kettle. It turned out that despite all the owner's talk of his granddad shunning modern comforts, the place had working electricity. "From good old-fashioned effort," his friend quipped, heaving a bulky duffel bag into the trunk, one that seemed a whole lot bigger once James really looked at it. Taking a closer peek around the house later, James stumbled on a couple of things the owner hadn't bothered mentioning: a rickety shed tacked onto the side wall like an afterthought and a trapdoor in the entryway leading down to a cellar. That hatch was fitted so tight it might as well have been part of the floorboards. James only noticed it while scrubbing away layers of ancient grime, wondering how anyone who had lived here before ever pried it open. No ring or handle existed. After some wrestling, it finally gave way with a long and creaky groan under the combined might of his stubbornness and a steel screwdriver, thanks to his friend for tossing that gem into the supplies. James squinted cautiously into the shadowy and earthy-smelling hole below. The faint beam from his flashlight just barely picked out crooked shelves lined with dusty jars, a jumble of shovels and rakes dumped on the dirt floor, soggy cardboard boxes, and a flimsy wooden ladder sloping downward, all of it cloaked in a thick shroud of cobwebs. James lingered over the open pit for a while, lost in thought, but eventually decided the cellar could wait its turn. He slammed the trapdoor shut with a thud and got back to scrubbing the rest of the house. Come nightfall, worn out from the heap of chores he wasn't used to tackling, James sat at the freshly wiped-down table eating dinner, bone-tired but quietly pleased, taking in the fruits of his labor. No denying it, the place looked different now. He had even gone after the walls, scouring them clean of the grime that had settled in deep over the years. He scrubbed the window panes until they sparkled, swept away cobwebs and dust from every nook and cranny he could reach, and even tackled the stove, hauling out the caked-on filth to burn it off in the backyard with buckets of well water while shivering in the sharp chill of the early October evening as he worked. Patting himself on the back for the effort, he settled in to enjoy a modest dinner. Later, his friend rang up, asking if he needed anything brought over. James brushed it off, saying everything was under control, and invited him to swing by tomorrow to check out how he had settled into the place, maybe bringing along a bottle of that bourbon he loved so much. His buddy promised he would roll in around 8 in the evening. No other calls came through the rest of the day. James didn't have anyone else to dial up, and frankly, he didn't see the need. The hangover had finally let him loose. That well water turned out to be as good as it smelled, clean, crisp, and almost sweet. James dug into some ham on soft white bread, a handful of tangy pickles, and a pile of boiled potatoes, all courtesy of his friend's generous stash, washing it down with a steaming mug of tea. A lone bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the spotless room. Out in the evening dark, faint lights winked from houses across the street, homes of people James hadn't met yet. His stomach felt full and happy, while the day's weariness softened into something manageable. He couldn't recall the last time he had felt this at ease. Nope, coming here was the right call, he mused to himself, dunking another tea bag into hot water. He had had his doubts, no question, but now he was already looking forward to tomorrow, planning to sort out the shed and cellar, with a little laugh at how fired up he was about it all. Speaking of which, I ought to spruce up that outhouse too, since it's one stiff breeze away from falling apart, James thought as he drifted off to sleep on the broad bench, now made up with a thin mattress and fresh sheets, another win he owed to his friend's thoughtfulness. The next morning dawned crisp, perhaps even a touch too cold for comfort. James still had to wrap his head around how to get that stove going. Finishing off his coffee, he realized that while cleaning the place top to bottom yesterday, he hadn't come across a single thing tied to the old guy who had lived here before. Bet that grandson of his gutted the place after the old man kicked it, he thought with a sour twist of his mouth, picturing the scruffy landlord, then got started on the tasks he had lined up the night before. The shed, a slapdash mess of splintered and rotting boards, didn't turn up anything worth a darn. Just a bunch of chunky spiders eyeballing him like he had trespassed on their turf, scurrying off grudgingly as he swung the broom. The only halfway useful thing in there was an old plastic basin hanging on a nail, beat up but still in one piece. He swept the floor clean, then admitted with a sigh that was as far as he could take it. Time for the cellar. Grabbing the screwdriver again, James propped the entryway door wide open for some light, since there wasn't a lick of wiring in there, and started down the ladder, flashlight beam bouncing off each wobbly step. The cellar, no surprise, was every bit as sorry a sight as the shed, maybe worse. Cobwebs hung like curtains, and the spiders down here looked like they could hold their own in a fight. At least there was more to poke around in than just the blasted bugs. James didn't waste time on the jars of preserves, probably gone bad ages ago, and shoved them aside to chuck out later. Some narrow clay pots sealed tight with wax caught his eye for a second, but he erred on the side of caution, lumping them in with the vague and potentially dicey stuff he'd rather not mess with. There were also a few bags stuffed with who knows what, plus a bundle of brittle and yellowed bones, cat bones he figured, wrapped up in a ragged scrap of cloth. He tossed those over to the reject pile with a grimace. Then, buried under a tangle of webs, he spotted a small wooden chest tucked away on a wide shelf against the back wall. Dragging it closer, James felt a jolt of excitement, since it had a padlock and some real heft, no way it was empty. He gave the rest of the dank cellar a quick sweep, saw nothing else worth a second glance, and huffed his way back up the ladder, itching to bust open that little treasure box. With the screwdriver and a chisel he had scrounged up, the chest didn't stand a chance, its lid cracked off and hit the floor in pieces. What he found inside knocked the wind right out of James. He spread the chest's contents across the table, stuff that looked like it belonged in a museum. Being a metallurgist by trade, he could tell the comb was forged from some serious metal, but the stones set into it? They could have been priceless gems or just shiny trash for all he knew, since they were a riddle he couldn't crack. If they were the real deal, though, his breath caught at the thought of what they might fetch. How that old man's grandson missed this haul was a head-scratcher. James picked up the mirror and held it up, catching his reflection in its murky and almost cobwebby surface. It took a beat, like it was deciding whether to show him, but when it did, he thought for the first time in forever that he didn't look half bad. Something about that mirror felt like it scrubbed him clean inside. A little flustered by the sudden vanity, he started to set it down when he noticed his hair was all over the place. James had always taken quiet pride in his thick mane, barely thinned or grayed with age, kept neat and combed back. He ran the antique comb through it, and every stroke sent a shiver of pure bliss down his spine. He could have sworn his hair crackled faintly, like it was happy. Shaking off the goofy idea, he kept going, until his phone shattered the moment with a loud ring. Scowling, he laid the mirror and comb on the table and grabbed it. His friend was on the line, sounding glum, saying work was dragging him out of town for a week. "Want me to swing by with my keys? You could crash at my place instead. No heat or running water out there, so what's the point by yourself?" his friend offered. James waved it off, insisting he would manage just fine and that he was actually liking it here. "Your call," his buddy said, skepticism dripping from his voice, before adding with a firm edge. "Either way, I'm dropping my keys with the neighbor and letting them know you're around, just in case." They swapped a warm goodbye, and James sighed over the scrapped visit, glanced at his reflection again, still liking what he saw, and reached for the kettle to boil some water. Over the next few days, James kept busy hauling out the cellar's junk and putting the house in order. He didn't bother with the stove, too much trouble without his friend to sort out fuel, and instead trekked into the town center where the main shops clustered, picking up a beefy space heater to keep the chill at bay. While he was at it, he grabbed some random essentials too: an extension cord, a power strip, a handful of nails, and a cheap water boiler. Weirdly, he didn't miss having a television or internet one bit. Back when he had left the city, he hadn't even thought to pack his laptop along. And, wildest thing yet for a guy like him, he didn't feel the least bit restless or bored without any of it. Come evening, after winding down from the day's grunt work, James would sit for hours with that cellar mirror in front of him, running the old comb through his hair. The notion that this might be an odd way for a guy his age to pass the time never even crossed his mind, since it felt as natural as breathing. Calling it a hobby didn't do it justice. It was more like a ceremony or even a full-on ritual, considering how much weight he put into it. First, he would carefully unwrap the mirror from the bubble wrap he stored it in, keeping it safe from any clumsy mishaps, and stare long and hard into its shadowy and mysterious depths, wondering just how many faces it had reflected over its countless years. He saw it as alive, not just some lifeless object. Only after that, like he was tuning into the echoes of all those past souls, would he pick up the comb and start brushing, slow and deliberate strokes, one after another, down the full length of his hair. Each pass felt as good as the first time, a quiet kind of joy that settled deep in his bones. It was almost like meditating. With every sweep of the comb, his reflection in that mirror seemed to take on a new gravity, a touch of something regal. He couldn't peel his eyes away, only stopping when his arm begged for a break. Then he would sigh, a little wistful, set the comb aside, and give the mirror one last lingering look. The walls, now free of their old dirt and dust, stood quiet witnesses to it all. Days rolled by like that. It had been over a week since James first rolled into this little town. He lived like a recluse, not making the slightest effort to meet any neighbors. Nobody came knocking either. James started letting his beard grow out and decided it looked pretty darn good on him. Twice in that stretch, as evening crept in, he made a quick run to the store for some basic groceries. His friend called a few times, griping about his jerk of a boss, some guy James didn't know, and fussy clients who kept changing their minds, always asking how James was holding up out there and if everything was all right. James brushed off the concern, telling him he was doing just fine and not to worry, though he did nudge him to track down some top-shelf bourbon since the local stuff was barely fit to drink. His buddy laughed and swore he would hunt down the best bottle he could find. James couldn't get over himself. Books, television, and the internet, all the things that used to fill his time, none of it mattered anymore. Even women didn't cross his mind, and he wasn't exactly ancient yet. Never hitched, sure, but he had had his share of flings and kept the ladies interested right up until he ditched the city. Noticing that shift offhand, he shrugged and leaned harder into his mirror time. It wasn't just about seeing himself anymore. Now, when he stared into it, he would melt into its unfathomable depths, and all sorts of visions would flicker to life right there in front of him, conjured up by that strange and glassy surface. Sometimes it was just random flashes, quick bursts like old slides popping up and vanishing, faces of people he guessed the mirror had caught over its long haul. Other times, though, the visions stitched together into something bigger, something he could almost piece apart: creepy rituals with animals getting sliced up, sometimes even people, furious mobs waving torches high, houses going up in flames, and gnarled black trees looming in a midnight forest. Early on, it all played out mute, but then sounds started creeping in: shrieks, snarls, groans, and faint rustling. Later, he would get these fleeting blanks in his head, like he had lost track of the last hour and couldn't pin down what he had been up to. Then there were thoughts, cravings, and little actions that felt second nature to his hands but totally foreign to who he was. It didn't bug him too much, though. Those shadowy figures from the mirror's other side started feeling real as anything to him. No way he would give them up now, since he was convinced he had cracked open a window to some bygone era or a whole different world. He felt hand-picked for it, though he didn't bother wondering by who or why. One thing he did clock: the more he combed his hair, the sharper and livelier those visions got. Slack off on the combing, though, and no matter how long he stared into that mirror, all he would see was his own face looking back, nothing more. Any ideas he had had about prying the stones out of the comb, getting them appraised, and cashing in if they turned out to be real gems had fizzled out ages ago. Now, even if someone held a gun to his head, he wouldn't let go of that enchanted thing. He had a hunch the handkerchief was more than meets the eye too, but he didn't mess with it yet, just laid it out flat on the table before setting the mirror down, figuring it made the visions pop clearer and brighter somehow. One morning, while James was chewing through breakfast, a chipper knock rattled the windowpane, and his friend's voice sang out from the yard. "Hey, Jimmy, still kicking, you old hermit?" James jolted upright, grinning, and hollered back, alive and well. "Quit standing out there, come on in." The front door banged open, footsteps clomped through the entry, and there was his buddy, lugging a hefty bag in one hand. James jumped up, arms flung wide for a big welcome hug. But his friend's reaction threw him for a loop. First off, the guy's happy-go-lucky grin melted into a mix of confusion and something like fear. He jerked back, throwing up a hand to stop James. "Whoa, whoa, easy there, old-timer," he said, his voice shaky and weird. Darting a quick look around the room, he added, "Where's Jimmy at?" James burst out laughing, figuring it was some dumb joke, and stepped in for another try at that hug, but his friend planted a hand on his chest and pushed him back. "Knock it off, Gramps," his friend barked, his tone hard now. "This ain't a game. Where's my friend? Did this guy shove him out and take over, or what? Just wait, you slimy punk, since I'll fix you good." He yanked his phone from his pocket, fingers fumbling. James stared, thrown off, and muttered, "Think this joke's gone far enough, don't you?" "What joke, you old coot?" his buddy snapped back, punching in a number. "You and that creep are about to get a real laugh." He jammed the phone to his ear. Right then, James's phone started buzzing loud on the table. James shot him a dry and pointed look. His friend's face went from ticked off to blank, then lit up like he had cracked the case. "You gutsy little thieves," he yelled, almost sounding impressed. "You're toast now." He bolted out the door, leaving James standing there, dumbstruck. Peeking out the window, James watched him stomp off, already yapping into his phone again. Shrugging, he wondered what had gotten into his old pal's head. Hope he ain't cracked up. Either it's a lousy prank, or... He couldn't nail down what that "or" might be. Another shrug, and he tried ringing his friend back, but the call got rejected. Brushing off the oddball behavior, James went back to his breakfast. About 15 minutes later, as he was wiping down the table, voices kicked up outside, followed by a loud and no-nonsense knock at the door. Baffled, James glanced out the window and saw his friend out there, jabbering away, all worked up to a handful of cops. He took a step back. The officers' stone-cold faces loomed close. His buddy fixed him with a smug and venomous stare and told the cops, This joker tried throwing his arms around me like we're best pals or something. We'll handle it, the cop right in James's face said shortly, then turned to him. Mind if we step inside? He didn't wait for a yes, brushing past and making James sidestep. The whole crew filed in after. James eased the door shut behind them and stood there, eyeing the intruders without a word. Your name? A mustached lieutenant demanded, locking eyes with him. Besides him and James's friend, there were two more cops, a stocky young sergeant and a fresh-faced girl with no rank on her shoulders. James smirked faintly. Who's this I'm talking to? The lieutenant's cheeks went pink, and he rattled off fast, Lieutenant Hank Dawson, patrol unit, whipping out his badge like a card trick before snapping, ID, now. James handed over his wallet with another little smirk. Dawson flipped it open, thumbed through it for a bit, then slapped it shut and slid it into his own pocket. James Carter, you're coming with us to the station so we can confirm who you are and track down the guy whose ID you just handed over. James froze, staring at the guy's gall, too stunned to even sputter a reply. Hold up a second, James finally exploded, his shock giving way to pure indignation. All I did was grow a beard. If this is some kind of setup, I'm not here for it. He shot a furious look at his friend. You got no shame? What a piece of work, his buddy hissed, turning to the cops. Good thing you're here, or I'd. That's enough, Dawson cut him off sharply. Cut the cops talk, since we're past that. You, he swung back to James, get your coat, you're riding with us. We'll sort it out downtown. Seething, James yanked his jacket on hard, snarling under his breath, you're gonna regret this, because I won't let it slide. Heard that one before, Dawson replied, his voice flat as a board. And you, he nodded at James's friend, you're coming too. You bet I am, the guy jumped in, eager as a kid at Christmas. I need to know what these clowns did with my friend. He glared at James like he was dirt. Probably cleaned him out and didn't even ditch his SIM card. James didn't bother looking back at him, just followed the officers out. They trudged past the busted-up gate he had never gotten around to fixing and stopped at a patrol SUV parked about 10 yards off. A couple of old ladies and some guy in a quilted jacket thrown over a bare chest stood nearby, yakking away, until they caught sight of James coming their way. Then something crazier than his friend's refusal to recognize him went down. Both old ladies locked eyes on James like he was some kind of sideshow oddity, then, like they had rehearsed it, started crossing themselves over and over, hollering loud enough to wake the dead. Lord protect me! Lord protect me, they shouted before scattering in opposite directions, screaming their heads off down the street. James and the cops, all of them, stopped dead, jaws dropped, watching the women hightail it. Then everyone turned to the guy, who didn't cross himself or bolt but went white as a ghost, staring at James like he had seen a nightmare come to life. Dawson gave the sergeant a quick nod, the younger cop clamped a firm hand on James's arm. Stepping right up to the guy, Dawson asked, "You know this man?" "You're darn right I do," he said, still gawking at James. "That's our own Nate Sipowicz." Dawson flicked a glance at James, who had gone stiff as a board at the name. "Well, that settles it. Who are you calling Nate Sipowicz?" James demanded, glaring straight at Dawson. "What's that mean?" the lieutenant fired back, bristling. "You just said." "Because," the guy broke in, his voice choking, "Nate Sipowicz, whom folks called Nate the Witch, died 2 years ago." That hit like a sledgehammer. The cop, James, and his friend, they all turned to statues. Then James forced out, "What Nate Sipowicz?" "What witch?" Dawson paused, then said firmly, "Fine, we'll hash it out at the station, figuring who's dead and who's not." He faced James again. "Let's move, old man." "Who you calling an old man?" James roared, losing it completely, thrashing to yank his arm free from the sergeant's iron grip. Dawson tilted the SUV's side mirror toward him and jerked a finger. "Take a look." James shuffled over, still held tight, and peered in. What he saw knocked him flat: an ancient relic gawking back, wild and combed hair like a lion's mane, wrinkles carved deep as ravines, and eyes murky like stagnant well water. He stared, dumbstruck, at that alien face for a few long beats, then let out a short gasp and crumpled to the ground, dead as a doornail. "How much longer we stuck here?" the rookie girl whined, slouched by the gate, watching the ambulance peel off with the body. Back inside, Dawson was poking through the dead guy's stuff. Amid the sparse junk piled on the bench, he fished out a lumpy wad of bubble wrap from a corner. Peeling it open, he found a shimmery handkerchief wrapped around a handheld mirror and a heavy metal comb decked with flashy stones. Curious, he scratched at one with his nail, then, after a sneaky peek at the door, dragged the comb through his thick black hair a few times, staring into the mirror's weird and hazy surface. His face lit up with a mix of awe and something bigger, like he had just tapped into something wild. Voices floated in from the yard. Dawson glanced toward the door, quick as a flash rewrapped the stuff in the handkerchief, and shoved it deep into his uniform pocket. Stepping out into the brisk and almost winter air, he grinned, feeling the satisfying heft of those odd treasures against his side. James Carter's story ended as fast as his bizarre obsession with that mirror and comb had kicked off. Was it magic, madness, or something else entirely? No one could say. But Dawson, walking off with those creepy finds, might have just started down the same road, blind to where it would take him. The house went quiet again, waiting for whoever would come next.